that blue-flamed, fast-talking god of the underworld. Sharp, sarcastic, always one step behind Hercules. If you grew up watching Disney's Hercules, you know exactly who we're talking about. Hades, the villain you love to laugh at. The guy whose plans always fell apart at the worst moment. And yet, somehow, you couldn't help but like him anyway. But what if the version Disney gave us was just the surface? And underneath it, buried in the depths of Greek mythology, there's a completely different god waiting to be found. That's what we're diving into today. We're going behind the screen, past the jokes and the blue fire, into the ancient myths themselves, to meet the real Hades. Not the villain, not the punchline, the king of the underworld, and the story he was never given a chance to tell. By the end of this, don't be surprised if you see him differently. Because when you look at what the myths actually say, his story isn't easy to reduce to a simple label. There's a weight to it, a complexity. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So let's set aside everything we think we know, and listen to what the myths are actually saying. This story is more complicated than you'd expect, and far more human. Disney gave us a Hades who was always on. Sharp tongue, quick temper, blue flames shooting off his head every time something went wrong. He was obsessed with taking down Olympus, desperate to get rid of Hercules, endlessly scheming and failing. A classic villain, a lovable one, sure, but a villain all the same. The Hades of Greek mythology, barely recognizable by comparison. No blue flames, no sarcastic one-liners. Instead, ancient art and later tradition often imagine him as a dark-haired, bearded, regal figure, stern, distant, and marked by an authority that even the other gods treated with caution. In Greek myth, Hades is not portrayed as a sarcastic schemer plotting against Olympus. What the sources give us instead is a cold, commanding ruler of the dead, serious, removed, and absolutely in control of his domain. There's also no major Greek myth in which Hades is cast as a rebel trying to overthrow Zeus. That's a Disney invention. In the myths, he was one of 3 brothers who divided the world between them. Zeus took the sky, Poseidon took the sea, and Hades took the world below. It wasn't a punishment. Exactly. It was a role, a massive, thankless, essential one. And in the myths, he simply rules the realm assigned to him, without any major tradition of rebellion against it. Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Aeacus, who weighed each soul according to the life it had lived. Hades was the king of that realm, but the role of direct judge more often fell to them. Metals, minerals, and the fertility hidden beneath the soil. The name reflected a belief that what lies underground belongs to his domain. Many Greeks also seem to have preferred using euphemistic titles like Pluton rather than invoking the name Hades too directly. Whether this was out of fear, reverence, or simply custom is hard to say with certainty. But the preference for indirect names tells us something about how his presence was felt. Death and abundance, darkness and the wealth beneath the earth, both in the same being. That duality is part of what makes him so hard to reduce to a simple label. He was never just the bad guy. He was the god nobody wanted to think about. Necessary, powerful, and deeply misunderstood. He was the part of existence no one wanted to look at directly, and he held that space, in silence, for all of time. Now let's talk about Persephone, because this is the story that tends to define how people see Hades. And it's also the story most people only know half of. The surface version is simple. Hades saw Persephone in a field of flowers, took her to the underworld, and her mother Demeter, goddess of the harvest, caused the earth to go barren until her daughter was returned. It sounds straightforward. It sounds like something a villain would do. But sit with the myth a little longer, and the picture gets more complicated. By any modern reading, what Hades did was wrong. Taking Persephone without her consent, without her mother's knowledge, is not something the myth asks us to overlook. That part is clear, but the myth doesn't leave it there. What unfolds over time is more layered. The sources present Persephone not only as the abducted daughter of Demeter, but also as the formidable queen of the underworld, a figure of real authority in her own right. Later retellings often link her annual return to the world above with the renewal of the earth, and her descent back below with the barren season that follows. In some older Greek agricultural contexts, this may reflect the dry period after harvest rather than winter as we know it. But in many later tellings, her absence became associated with winter, and her return with spring. She became, in the mythological tradition, the bridge between life and death. The living world and the world below, connected through her. The myths don't explicitly say his desire came from isolation. But many modern readers find that interpretation compelling when they look at who he was and where he lived. A king with no queen. A realm the living feared and the dead could not leave. No companions. No warmth. No place in the brightness of Olympus. Whether that shaped his longing or not, the myth gives us a god who wanted Persephone. and a world permanently changed because of it. That's not the story of a cartoon villain kidnapping a princess. It's something older, stranger, and harder to resolve neatly. Here's the thing about Disney's Hercules. It did something genuinely valuable. It took an ancient mythology and made it funny, bright, and accessible to audiences around the world. The Hades it created is genuinely entertaining, and for a lot of people, he was their first introduction to Greek mythology. But something was lost in that translation. The myths don't usually present Hades as a cartoonish embodiment of evil. What they give us instead is a colder, more complex figure, a ruler tied to death, distance, and necessity. He was stern, he was pitiless at times, but he was also essential. And compared with many Olympian gods, he appears in surprisingly few myths of meddling in the world above. In many modern readings, Hades can feel like one of the most solitary of the gods. Not by choice exactly, but by the nature of what he ruled. The other Olympians had their stories in the world above. Hades had the dead, the dark, and the weight of finality. Later readers have often found something quietly compelling in that picture. A king doing the work no one else would do, largely unseen and rarely celebrated. We tend to cast our shadows as villains. Whatever we're afraid of, whatever we don't want to think about, we push it into the dark and give it a frightening face. Hades became that figure, the embodiment of the thing no one wants to talk about, wearing the label of the bad guy because it was easier than sitting with what he actually represented. But when you look at the myths directly, you find someone else entirely. Not a villain, not a hero, something harder to categorize. A god who held the part of existence that no one else wanted to hold. What are they really carrying? Hades held all of it, in silence, for as long as the myths remember. So, does that change how you see him? If this gave you something to think about, drop your thoughts in the comments. Which god's story do you want to explore next? There are so many layers still waiting to be uncovered, and we'll be here to dig into them.
And here's what I keep coming back to. We live in a world that's obsessed with sides. Hero or villain, light or dark, the one you root for, and the one you don't. It's a clean system, it's comfortable, and it works beautifully in a 90-minute animated film. But mythology was never built for comfort. The ancient Greeks didn't create their gods to be role models or cautionary tales in the way we might expect. They created them to hold something. To carry the parts of human experience that were too large, too heavy, too contradictory to fit inside a single mortal life. Each god was a container for a truth the Greeks couldn't look at directly, and so they gave it a name, a face, a story, and placed it at a safe mythological distance. Hades was the container for the truth nobody wanted. Not evil, not punishment, just the part of existence that waits at the end of every story. The part that doesn't negotiate, doesn't make exceptions, doesn't smile and wave. The part that simply is. And I think that's why he became the villain so easily. Not because the myths made him one, but because we needed him to be one. It's far easier to boo a scheming bad guy than to sit quietly with the thing he actually represents. Think about what it means to rule the dead. Not to cause death, not to celebrate it, just to receive it. Every soul, from every era, from every corner of the mortal world, eventually arrives at his door. The great and the forgotten, the celebrated and the silent. Every war, every famine, every quiet death in a small room somewhere, all of it eventually flows through his domain. He doesn't get to look away. He never gets to look away. There's something almost unbearable about that image, if you sit with it long enough. A ruler who receives everything the living world produces, not the glory, not the celebrations, just the final exhale of every life ever lived. And he holds it, in order, in silence, without complaint, according to the myths. That's not villainy, that's something closer to the heaviest kind of duty imaginable. And then there's this, something the myths quietly suggest, even if they never say it outright. Of the three brothers who divided the world, only one never left his domain to interfere in mortal affairs. Zeus came down constantly, into human lives, human stories, human beds. Poseidon stirred the seas and swallowed ships and shook the earth when it suited him. The other Olympians wove themselves into every war, every love story, every quest. Hades stayed below. He ruled what was his, and he did not reach beyond it. In the vast catalogue of Greek myth, there are almost no stories of Hades leaving the underworld to meddle with the living. The myths give us a god who understood his boundaries, perhaps better than any other deity in the entire pantheon. There's a word for that, and it's not evil. Now I want to be careful here, because the myths are not a simple redemption arc. The story of Persephone is not resolved cleanly, and it shouldn't be. What happened in that myth was a rupture, a violence done to choice and consent. And a mother's bond with her daughter, and no amount of philosophical reframing changes that fact. The myths don't ask us to forgive it, and neither should we, but they do ask us to look at the full picture. Because what the myth ultimately gave us was not a story of darkness winning. It was a story of a world that learned to hold both. Spring and winter, life and death, the world above and the world below, bound together in a cycle neither side could escape, and in that binding, a kind of terrible, ancient balance. Persephone didn't simply become a victim frozen in the dark. She became the queen of it. She became the one figure who could move between both worlds, who carried the weight of death and the promise of return simultaneously. The myth transformed her, and in transforming her, it transformed what the underworld meant. It stopped being only a place of ending. It became a place of passage. That shift, from ending to passage, is one of the most profound things Greek mythology ever quietly said about death. And it happened in his domain. In his story, in the place the living feared most. So what do we do with all of this? I think the myths are asking us, gently, persistently, to reconsider what we push to the margins. Every culture, every era, every storytelling tradition has its shadow figures. The ones we cast as villains because they represent something we'd rather not examine. The ones who carry the uncomfortable truths. The ones who hold the weight of the things we refuse to name. And I think the myths are saying look closer. Not to excuse what's dark. Not to romanticize the difficult. But to ask, honestly, what is this figure actually carrying? What truth is too heavy to hold in the light? And what happens to us, as a culture, when we keep pushing that weight into the dark and calling it evil instead of necessary? He sat at the edge of everything the ancient world knew. He was the god of what comes after. The keeper of all that was lost. The ruler of the realm every living soul was moving toward, one breath at a time, whether they thought about it or not. And he held that space. Not with blue flames and sarcastic one-liners. Not with schemes and temper tantrums. But with the cold, absolute, unyielding composure of a god who understood something that none of the bright Olympians above him ever quite had to face. That endings are not the enemy of meaning. They are the condition of it. Without the boundary he held, nothing above would matter the way it did. The light exists in full only because somewhere below, the dark is being held in order. Every harvest, every spring, every return of warmth to the earth, all of it moves through his domain on its way back to the living. He was never the villain of the story. He was the reason the story could exist at all. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth more than we ever gave him credit for.